The gas station sat on a lonely stretch of highway, the kind of place that seemed stuck in time. The rusted sign creaked in the wind, and the cracked asphalt told stories of thousands of travelers who had stopped there before moving on, forgetting it as soon as they left. It was the kind of spot where no one expected anything to happen, just fuel up and go. For Sarah, it was just another stop. The drive had been long, and she was tired, but she didn't let it show. She stood by her old, beat-up truck, pumping gas while the dry wind tugged at her plain sweatshirt. Her jeans were faded, her sneakers scuffed, and her hair was tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She didn't look like much, and that was fine with her. She liked it that way. People always saw what they wanted to see, just a woman on her way somewhere, maybe a teacher or a nurse. Harmless. Forgettable. But if anyone bothered to look closer, they'd notice the way she carried herself. There was a quiet strength in her posture, like someone who knew how to handle herself when things got rough. Her eyes, a steady gray, held an intensity that seemed out of place on such an unassuming face. Most people missed it. Sarah had gotten used to that. In fact, she preferred it. The gas pump clicked, signaling that the tank was full. She put the nozzle back and wiped her hands on a rag, her movements calm and deliberate. She was about to head inside to pay when she heard them. Engines. They came roaring down the highway, a thunderous sound that made the windows of the small gas station rattle. The first bike sped into the lot, followed by 5 more, all of them glinting under the fading sunlight. The riders pulled in like they owned the place, parking their motorcycles in a messy line near the pumps. The leader dismounted first. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a leather jacket that had seen better days. A long, jagged scar ran down the side of his face, disappearing into his scruffy beard. His eyes scanned the lot lazily before landing on Sarah. He smirked. The rest of the bikers followed, all wearing the same uniform of leather jackets and cocky grins. They carried themselves with the swagger of men who thought the world owed them something. The youngest of the group, barely out of his teens, glanced at Sarah and quickly looked away, almost embarrassed. The others didn't bother hiding their amusement. To them, Sarah was just another nobody. A woman traveling alone, an easy target for their jokes, maybe even something worse. They didn't know who they were looking at. No one ever did. Sarah watched them out of the corner of her eye as she closed the truck's gas cap. She didn't react to the loud laughter or the way the leader kept staring at her. Instead, she stayed focused, keeping her movements calm and precise. She had learned a long time ago not to give away too much. The leader leaned against his bike, crossing his arms over his chest. Well, he said, his voice carrying easily over the rumble of the cooling engines. Looks like we're not the only ones out here today. One of the other bikers, a wiry man with a missing front tooth, chuckled. What's the matter, sweetheart? Long drive got you all tuckered out. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't even look their way. The leader straightened, his boots crunching on the gravel as he took a step closer. Hey, I'm talking to you, he said, his tone sharper now. Sarah finally turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, her gray eyes steady. She didn't speak, just let the silence stretch between them. For a moment, the leader hesitated. There was something about the way she looked at him, something that made him feel unsettled. But then one of his buddies laughed, and he quickly pushed the feeling aside. You lost or something, another biker called out. Or you just like hanging out in places like this? Sarah's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She shook her head slightly and turned back toward her truck. Her reaction or lack of one seemed to annoy the leader. He took another step closer, his hand resting on the chain hanging from his belt. Don't be rude, he said, his voice lowering. We're just trying to be friendly. Friendly? Sarah almost laughed. She'd met men like this before. They used words like friendly to mask their real intentions, to see how much they could get away with before someone pushed back. Most people didn't push back. But Sarah wasn't most people. She leaned into the open window of her truck, grabbing her wallet from the seat. The movement made the leader pause, his eyes narrowing as he watched her carefully. Sarah could feel the tension rising in the air, but she didn't let it bother her. "Is there a problem?" she asked finally, her voice calm and even. The leader chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "No problem," he said, his grin widening. "Just seems like you're in a bit of a hurry. You got somewhere to be?" Sarah's gray eyes met his, steady and unblinking. "Yeah," she said simply. "And you're in my way." The younger biker shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Sarah and the leader. "Maybe we should just get our gas and go," he muttered. The leader shot him a glare. "Relax, kid," he said. "We're just talking." Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she straightened and stepped away from her truck, moving toward the small convenience store attached to the gas station. Her steps were slow and measured, like she had all the time in the world. The bikers watched her go, their laughter fading as they exchanged uncertain looks. "She's got some attitude, huh?" one of them said, trying to lighten the mood. "Yeah," the leader replied, his eyes narrowing as he watched her disappear into the store. "But don't worry. I've dealt with her kind before." Inside the store, Sarah handed her cash to the attendant, a nervous-looking man in his 50s who seemed more interested in the bikers outside than in her. "You okay out there?" he asked quietly, glancing over her shoulder. Sarah smiled faintly. "I'll be fine," she said. The attendant didn't look convinced, but he didn't push the issue. He handed her the change, and she nodded her thanks before heading back outside. The bikers were still there, lounging by their bikes and talking in low voices. The leader looked up as she approached, his smirk returning. "Done already?" he asked. Sarah didn't answer. She climbed into her truck, started the engine, and backed out of the parking lot without so much as a glance in their direction. The leader watched her go, his smirk fading into a frown. "What's her deal?" he muttered. The younger biker shrugged. "She seemed different." The leader snorted. "Yeah, well, I've seen plenty of different before. Trust me, she's nothing special." But as Sarah's truck disappeared down the highway, a small part of him couldn't shake the feeling that he was wrong. Sarah's truck moved down the road, her gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The golden light bathed the empty highway, painting long shadows across the cracked pavement. She kept her hands steady on the wheel, her breathing calm, but her mind was sharper than ever. Those bikers weren't just passing through. Sarah had learned to read people quickly, to pick up on the little tells that most others missed. The way the leader carried himself, how his smirk lingered just a little too long, and how his buddies watched him for cues, it was all too familiar. She'd dealt with men like that before. And men like that didn't give up easily. Behind her, the gas station shrank in the rearview mirror, but the tension in her chest didn't loosen. She glanced once, twice, and then a third time in the mirror, her eyes scanning the empty stretch of road behind her. It wasn't empty for long. The first engine roared to life, echoing faintly in the distance. Sarah's hands tightened on the wheel as she spotted the pack of bikes emerging from the shimmering heat haze on the horizon. "Figures," she muttered under her breath, her tone calm but edged with annoyance. The bikers were closing in, their headlights bouncing against the fading sunlight. They weren't in a rush, but their approach was deliberate, the low growl of their engines filling the quiet. Sarah didn't speed up. She kept her pace steady, her mind already running through possible scenarios. She wasn't afraid, that wasn't something she allowed herself to feel anymore, but she wasn't reckless, either. The first bike came up alongside her, the leader glancing over with that same smirk from earlier. His scar caught the light as he nodded at her, a gesture that might have seemed friendly if it weren't for the sharp edge in his eyes. "Nice truck," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the noise of the engines. "Where you heading in such a hurry?" Sarah didn't answer. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, her grip on the wheel firm but controlled. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he shouted, leaning closer. The other bikes began to close in around her, forming a loose semicircle that boxed her in. Still, she didn't flinch. The leader revved his engine, pulling just slightly ahead before cutting sharply in front of her truck. Sarah eased off the gas, letting the vehicle slow as the bikes tightened their formation. She exhaled slowly. This is what they want, she reminded herself. Control. Fear. Don't give it to them. Pulling the truck to a stop, she shifted into park and killed the engine. The bikers followed suit, cutting off their motorcycles one by one until the quiet of the highway was replaced by an uneasy silence. The leader swung off his bike, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached. His men stayed close behind, spreading out in a loose arc around Sarah's truck. "Now, don't take this the wrong way," he began, his tone mockingly polite. "But you kind of hurt my feelings back there. A guy tries to be friendly, and this is the thanks he gets?" Sarah rolled down her window slowly, her movements deliberate. Her gray eyes locked onto his, calm and unwavering. "I don't owe you anything," she said simply. The leader's grin widened, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, you've got a mouth on you, don't you?" he said, leaning against the truck door. "I like that. Makes things more interesting." Behind him, one of the younger bikers shifted nervously. "Maybe we should just let her go," he muttered under his breath. "We don't want any trouble." The leader shot him a glare that silenced him immediately. "We're just talking," he said, turning back to Sarah. "Aren't we, sweetheart?" Sarah didn't answer. She leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, but her eyes stayed locked on the leader's face. She wasn't sizing him up, she'd already done that. She was waiting. The tension in the air grew thicker, the kind that made people's instincts scream to do something, anything, to break it. But Sarah had learned to live in that space, to let the unease hang until her opponent made the first move. And the leader did. With a casual motion, he reached up and grabbed the edge of her window, his fingers curling over the glass. "See, out here on the road, respect is everything," he said, his tone low and almost conversational. "And you've been real disrespectful." Sarah's eyes flicked to his hand, then back to his face. "Let go of my truck," she said, her voice calm but firm. The leader laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Or what?" he said, leaning in closer. "What are you gonna do about it?" The other bikers chuckled, the sound rippling through the group like a wave. But the younger one, the nervous one, wasn't laughing. His gaze darted between Sarah and the leader, and there was a flicker of something in his expression, doubt, maybe even fear. Sarah didn't move. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. The leader's smirk faltered for just a moment, and that was all the confirmation Sarah needed. Slowly, she pushed the truck door open, forcing him to step back. She climbed out, her movements fluid and controlled, and stood to her full height. She wasn't tall, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made her seem bigger than she was. The leader tilted his head, his grin returning as he looked her up and down. "Well, now we're getting somewhere," he said. "What's the matter? Couldn't handle a little teasing?" Sarah took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Her gray eyes were locked onto his, unblinking. "Last chance," she said quietly. "Walk away." The leader froze. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He glanced back at his men, as if looking for reassurance, but they were just as unsure as he was. "What's your deal, lady?" he asked, his voice wavering slightly. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. She held it up just long enough for the leader to see the military insignia engraved on the surface before tucking it away again. The leader's smirk vanished completely. His jaw tightened, and he took a step back, suddenly aware of just how badly he'd misjudged her. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice quieter now. Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No," she said. "You did." "Hey sweetheart," one of them called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Truck giving you trouble? Maybe we could lend a hand." The others laughed, their voices echoing in the still air. Sarah didn't flinch. She finished pumping gas, her expression steady, almost indifferent. The wind tugged at a loose strand of her dark hair, and she brushed it aside casually, as if she didn't notice the way the men were watching her. "I'm good, thanks," she said calmly, her tone polite but firm. That didn't sit well with the leader. He stepped closer, towering over her, the scent of motor oil and arrogance hanging thick around him. His leather jacket creaked as he moved, the jagged scar on his cheek catching the sunlight. "Kman, don't be like that," he said, grinning. "A little gratitude wouldn't hurt." His buddies chuckled as they leaned against their bikes, clearly entertained. Sarah's fingers twitched, but she stayed still. If they noticed the subtle scars on her hands or the way her posture hinted at training, they didn't show it. Her calm, controlled demeanor seemed to annoy them even more. "Just leave me alone," she said simply, turning back toward her truck. But they weren't done. The leader raised a hand, signaling to the others, and they began to fan out, casually stepping away from their bikes as if testing the waters. The youngest of the group, a lanky guy with nervous eyes, stayed where he was, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "See, here's the thing," the leader said, leaning against the truck and blocking her way. "You don't just walk away from us like that. We're trying to be friendly. And what do we get in return? A cold shoulder." Sarah sighed softly, her patience wearing thin. She glanced at the leader, her gray eyes steady and unreadable. "I said I'm fine," she repeated, her voice a fraction colder. The leader tilted his head, studying her with a smirk. "Feisty, huh? I like that." He turned to his men. "What do you guys think? Should we help her out anyway? Maybe she just doesn't know how to ask properly." Another round of laughter erupted, but this time, the sound grated against the stillness of the highway. Sarah could feel the tension thickening around her, like a storm cloud building overhead. Her heart rate stayed steady. Years of experience had trained her body to remain calm in situations like this. She glanced briefly at the nervous one in the back. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't even looking at her anymore. His eyes darted between his leader and the others, his discomfort clear. The leader stepped closer, his shadow falling over Sarah. He reached out and tapped her on the shoulder with 2 fingers, a mockingly gentle gesture. "Why don't you smile for us, sweetheart? Show us a little appreciation." She froze for a moment, not out of fear, but calculation. Her gaze dropped briefly to his hand, calloused, strong, but careless in the way it lingered too close. She inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower, and straightened her posture. "Don't touch me," she said softly. Her words were quiet, but they cut through the laughter like a blade. The leader's grin faltered for a split second, replaced by something darker. The others noticed, their chuckles fading into a tense silence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice lower now, a sharp edge creeping into it. "I said," Sarah repeated, meeting his gaze without blinking, "don't touch me." The leader stared at her, his jaw tightening. The air between them felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. His buddies shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado replaced by a cautious wariness. They didn't understand what was happening, but they could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Finally, the leader stepped back, holding up his hands in mock surrender. All right," he said, his grin returning. "No need to get all serious. We're just having a little fun, that's all." He turned to his men, motioning for them to back off. They hesitated but obeyed, shuffling back toward their bikes. Sarah watched them carefully, her expression unreadable. She could feel the adrenaline humming just beneath the surface, ready to kick in if she needed it. But for now, she let it simmer, waiting for the right moment. The leader leaned closer one last time, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But you're just another scared little girl pretending to be something you're not." Sarah's lips twitched, but not into a smile. It was a flicker of something else, something sharper. "Walk away while you still can," she said quietly. The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he looked like he might say something else. But then one of his men called out, "Boss, let's go. We've wasted enough time here." He hesitated, then shrugged as if brushing her off. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," he said, stepping back. "But watch yourself, sweetheart. Roads out here can be dangerous." With that, he turned and strode back to his bike, his men following reluctantly. Engines roared to life, and the group pulled out onto the highway, kicking up dust as they disappeared down the road. Sarah stood still for a moment, watching them go. Her hands rested at her sides, relaxed but ready. She waited until the sound of their engines faded completely before moving again. She climbed back into her truck, her movements deliberate, and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, but she didn't pull away immediately. Instead, she sat there for a moment, her grip on the wheel tightening ever so slightly. She wasn't afraid of them. She'd faced worse, much worse. But something about the way the leader had looked at her, the way his words had dripped with malice, left a sour taste in her mouth. And she knew, deep down, that they weren't finished. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah's truck rumbled into the parking lot of a small roadside diner. She'd been on the road for hours, the quiet hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires on pavement doing little to settle her mind. The diner was mostly empty, save for a couple of truckers nursing cups of coffee and a waitress wiping down the counter. Sarah parked near the back, out of sight from the main road, and stepped out, stretching her legs. Inside, the smell of fried food and coffee greeted her, a welcome contrast to the tension from earlier. She slid into a booth near the window, her back to the wall, and ordered a simple meal. But as she ate, her eyes kept drifting to the parking lot, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. She told herself she was just being cautious, but the knot in her stomach told a different story. The bikers were trouble. She knew their type all too well, men who thrived on power, on intimidation, on pushing people until they broke. And she knew they wouldn't let go of their bruised pride so easily. As she finished her meal and paid the bill, she caught the waitress giving her a curious glance. "Long day?" the woman asked, her tone friendly but cautious. Sarah offered a small smile. "Something like that," she said. The waitress nodded, her expression softening. "Well, you take care out there. Roads can be rough at night." "You don't have to tell me twice," Sarah replied, her tone light but with an undercurrent of seriousness. She stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around her like a cloak. The parking lot was empty, save for her truck and a couple of rigs parked near the edge. But as she climbed into the driver's seat, she caught a flicker of movement in the side mirror. Her heart didn't race. Instead, a calm focus settled over her. They were back. The night settled heavy and quiet over the highway, the only sound the distant hum of insects and the occasional rush of a passing car. Sarah didn't turn her head. She didn't need to. She knew they were watching. Her hand hovered over the ignition, but she didn't start the truck. Instead, she adjusted her rearview mirror slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of a figure moving in the shadows. The shape was unmistakable: leather jackets, broad shoulders, the glint of a chain. The bikers had returned. A less experienced person might have panicked, might have slammed on the gas and sped off into the night. But Sarah wasn't that person. She had learned long ago that fear clouded judgment. So instead, she exhaled slowly, her fingers steady as she reached under the seat, her hand brushing against cold steel. The handgun was clean, loaded, and familiar. She didn't pull it out. Not yet. There were rules to situations like this, rules she had memorized through hard lessons. The first: don't escalate. Let them make the first move. She leaned back in her seat, her posture casual, as if she hadn't noticed a thing. But her senses were sharp, scanning every movement in the parking lot, every shift of the shadows. A faint metallic clink reached her ears, the sound of boots on asphalt, approaching from the left. She caught the faintest whiff of motor oil and cigarette smoke. Then came the voice, low and smug, well, look who we found." Sarah didn't turn. She adjusted her mirror again, locking eyes with the reflection of the scarred leader as he stepped into view. His grin was wide, his posture loose, but his eyes held a dangerous gleam. "Thought you could just drive off and leave us behind, huh?" he said, leaning casually against the truck's door. His tone was playful, but there was a hardness beneath it, a warning. Sarah finally turned her head, meeting his gaze through the open window. Her expression was calm, almost bored. "I thought you had better things to do than follow me around," she said evenly. The leader chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But you didn't answer my question." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering her response. "What do you want?" He leaned closer, his grin widening. "Respect," he said, drawing the word out slowly. "You disrespected us back there at the gas station. Made me look bad in front of my boys. That's not something I can just let slide." Sarah's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "So this is about your ego," she said, her tone as cool as the night air. The leader's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. Behind him, two more bikers emerged from the shadows, their boots crunching on the gravel. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head, carried a length of chain looped casually over his shoulder. The other, taller and wiry, tapped a metal pipe against his palm. Sarah's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel, her thumb brushing against the texture of the leather. She took a mental inventory of her surroundings, the distance to the diner, the positioning of the trucks in the lot, the nearest cover. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. The leader's grin returned, wider this time. "See, that's where we're different," he said. "I don't mind a little trouble." He straightened up and gestured toward the truck. "Step out," he said, his tone shifting to something colder. "Let's have a little chat, face to face." Sarah didn't move. Her eyes flicked briefly to the side mirror, where she caught a glimpse of the nervous one, the lanky biker from earlier. He was hanging back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze darting between the leader and Sarah. "I think I'll stay right here," she said, her tone light but resolute. The leader's grin twisted into a sneer. "You've got a smart mouth, don't you?" he said, stepping closer. His hand moved to the door handle, but before he could pull it, Sarah spoke again. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The leader paused, his hand hovering over the handle. He tilted his head, studying her with a mix of curiosity and irritation. "And why's that?" he asked, his tone mocking. Sarah's gaze didn't waver. Because I don't think you're ready for what happens next, she said simply. For a moment, there was silence. The other bikers exchanged glances, their confidence faltering slightly. The leader's sneer deepened, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now, a flicker of doubt that he tried to mask with bravado. You think you're tough, he said, his voice rising slightly. You think you can scare me? Sarah's expression didn't change. She leaned back in her seat, her posture relaxed, her eyes never leaving his. I think you're making a mistake, she said quietly. The leader's jaw tightened, his hand clenching into a fist. He took a step back, glancing at his men. Let's teach her a lesson, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The stocky biker with the chain stepped forward, the metal links clinking ominously as he swung them in a slow, deliberate arc. The wiry one followed, gripping the pipe tightly, his knuckles white. But before they could take another step, Sarah moved. In one fluid motion, she reached under the seat and pulled out the handgun. The metallic click of the safety disengaging echoed in the stillness, freezing the bikers in their tracks. The leader's grin vanished. His eyes widened slightly as he stared at the weapon, then at Sarah. I said, she repeated, her voice steady and unyielding, leave me alone. For a moment, no one moved. The tension was electric, the air thick with unspoken challenges. The bikers shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of the cold, calculated determination in Sarah's eyes. The leader raised his hand slowly, his grin returning, but it was strained now, forced. All right, he said, taking a step back. No need to get all worked up. We were just messing around. Sarah didn't lower the gun. She kept her gaze locked on him, her grip steady, her stance unshakable. Get on your bikes, she said evenly. And don't come back. The leader hesitated, his pride warring with his sense of self-preservation. But the look in Sarah's eyes left no room for negotiation. He turned to his men, jerking his head toward their bikes. Let's go, he muttered, his voice tight with suppressed anger. The bikers retreated slowly, their movements reluctant, their expressions a mix of frustration and embarrassment. Engines roared to life once more, and one by one, they pulled out of the lot, disappearing into the night. Sarah watched them go, the gun still in her hand, her body still as stone. She waited until the sound of their engines faded completely before lowering the weapon. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breath didn't quicken. She was calm, controlled, her mind already shifting to the next step. Because she knew it wasn't over. The younger biker's nervous shuffle didn't go unnoticed. He stood a little further back, his hand rubbing the back of his neck as his eyes darted between Sarah and the others. Boss, he said again, his voice quieter this time, maybe we should just let her go. The leader turned sharply, his scowl deepening. What's the matter with you, kid? She's just a woman pumping gas. You scared of her? His voice dripped with mockery, loud enough for his gang to chuckle in agreement. The younger biker shrank back, his gaze dropping to the ground. Sarah's eyes flicked toward him briefly, then back to the leader. Her grip on the truck door remained steady, her knuckles no longer white but firm, as if she'd just decided something. The tension in the air was palpable, like the moment before a storm. 5 seconds, Sarah repeated, her voice cutting through the low rumble of laughter. It wasn't loud, but there was weight behind it. The leader rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck. 5 seconds, he said, mimicking her tone with exaggerated amusement. What are you gonna do in 5 seconds? Sing us a lullaby. Call the cops. The others joined in his laughter, but it was nervous now, uncertain. Something about her calmness was unsettling, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on why. Sarah's gaze didn't waver. She stood still, her body relaxed but grounded, her stance balanced in a way that wasn't obvious unless you knew what to look for. The leader, oblivious, took another step forward. "Go on, sweetheart," he taunted. "Do something. Show us what you've got." And then it happened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. A shift in Sarah's weight, a pivot of her foot. Her hand moved with deliberate precision, brushing against the hem of her jacket as she stepped back just slightly. The leader's smirk faltered. The younger biker noticed it first. His eyes widened, and he took a step back, bumping into one of the others. "Boss," he started, but the words stuck in his throat. Sarah's voice broke the silence. "4 seconds, she said, her tone even, unflinching. The leader hesitated, his bravado cracking for the first time. He glanced at his crew, looking for backup. "What are you waiting for?" he barked at them. "She's bluffing. Look at her." But they weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at him. And they weren't laughing. The stocky biker with the chain shifted uneasily, his hand tightening on the loop of metal. The wiry one with the pipe took a half step back, his expression uncertain. Sarah's lips twitched, a flicker of something between amusement and disdain. 3 seconds, she said, her voice slicing through the night like a blade. The leader's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to this. He was the one who intimidated people, who controlled the room with his presence. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. But Sarah wasn't playing by his rules. The air felt thicker now, charged with an energy none of them could quite name. The leader's gaze dropped to her hands, searching for a weapon, but there was nothing there. No knife, no gun. Just her standing calmly, her gaze steady, her posture unshakable. 2 seconds, she said, and this time, her voice carried a weight that made the stocky biker step back fully. The leader growled, his pride wounded. He lunged forward, reaching for her jacket. That was his first mistake. In one fluid motion, Sarah moved. She sidestepped his grab with a grace that seemed almost effortless, her body pivoting smoothly as she turned his momentum against him. Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with a precision that spoke of training, not instinct. Before he could react, she twisted. The leader let out a strangled cry as his wrist was forced into an unnatural angle. He stumbled forward, off balance, and Sarah stepped behind him, using his own weight to guide him into a hard collision with the side of the truck. The sound of metal meeting flesh echoed in the stillness. The younger biker gasped, his eyes wide. "What the?" The leader struggled, but Sarah didn't let go. Her grip on his wrist was ironclad, her movements controlled, efficient. She didn't waste energy. She didn't need to. "Let go of me," he snarled, his free hand swinging wildly. Sarah ducked easily, her body moving with a precision that wasn't just natural, it was practiced. The others froze, their weapons hanging limply in their hands as they watched, stunned. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice low and calm. "You're going to tell your men to back off. Then you're going to get on your bikes and leave." The leader hissed through clenched teeth, his pride warring with the pain in his wrist. "You're making a big mistake," he growled. Sarah's grip tightened just slightly, and he winced. "No," she said, her tone icy. "You did that when you decided to corner me." She released him suddenly, stepping back as he stumbled forward, clutching his wrist. He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with rage, but he didn't move toward her again. The younger biker was the first to speak. "Boss, we should go," he said, his voice trembling. The leader shot him a glare but didn't argue. His pride was wounded, but he wasn't stupid. Something about Sarah was off, and he wasn't about to test her again. "Fine," he spat, rubbing his wrist. "We're leaving. But this isn't over." Sarah didn't respond. She stood there, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, as the bikers backed away. They mounted their bikes in silence, the roar of their engines cutting through the tension. One by one, they pulled out of the lot, disappearing into the darkness. When the last tail light vanished, Sarah finally exhaled. She leaned against the truck, her hand brushing against her jacket, where a small concealed knife rested, untouched. She hadn't needed it. She glanced at the ground where the leader had stood, her expression unreadable. A faint smirk crossed her lips. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint hum of cicadas in the distance. Sarah remained still, her eyes scanning the dark highway where the bikers had vanished. Her calm exterior belied the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, then opened the truck door. But the night wasn't done with her yet. A faint sound, a low rumble, like thunder, reached her ears. She paused, listening intently. It grew louder, unmistakable now. Engines. The bikers were coming back. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through her nose. Of course, she muttered under her breath. She moved quickly, not rushing but deliberate in her actions. From under her seat, she pulled a small, nondescript bag. Inside was a set of items she hadn't touched in months: a first aid kit, a compact flashlight, a length of paracord, and a slim folding knife. Her hand hovered over the knife for a moment before she picked it up, sliding it into her back pocket. The rumble grew louder, the vibrations faintly shaking the ground beneath her boots. This time, she didn't wait by the truck. She stepped away from the gas pump, moving toward the side of the station where the shadows were deeper. As the first bike came into view, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The pack was larger now, 8 or 9 of them, their headlights piercing the darkness as they pulled into the lot. The leader was at the front, his wrist wrapped in a bandana, his expression a mix of fury and humiliation. He dismounted first, followed by the others. They spread out in a loose semicircle, their postures tense and aggressive. The younger biker was still there, lingering at the back, his unease evident in the way he avoided looking directly at Sarah. "She's gone," one of them muttered, glancing around the empty lot. "No," the leader snapped, his voice sharp. "She's here. I know it." Sarah stepped forward, emerging from the shadows with the same calm, measured stride. "Looking for me?" she asked, her tone neutral. All heads turned toward her. The leader's smirk returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, taking a step toward her. "But you made a big mistake messing with us." Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I warned you to leave," she said simply. "And we're back," the leader retorted, spreading his arms as if to show off his reinforcements. "Now what are you gonna do? Call the cops?" The others chuckled, but the sound was forced, lacking the confidence of earlier. There was something about her calmness, the way she stood there without flinching, that put them on edge. "I don't think the cops would make it in time," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. "But you might want to think about why you're really here." The leader barked a laugh. "You think you're gonna psychoanalyze me, sweetheart? Spare me. You got lucky back there. But now we're gonna make sure you learn some respect." Sarah's eyes flicked to the younger biker at the back of the group. His gaze met hers for a brief moment, and she saw something there: hesitation, doubt, maybe even guilt. He didn't want to be here. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, her question directed at him. The others froze, their heads turning toward him in surprise. He hesitated, glancing nervously at the leader. "Don't answer her," the leader snapped, his voice laced with anger. But Sarah didn't look away. Her calm, steady gaze remained locked on the younger biker. "You don't have to do this," she said, her tone softer now. "Whatever you think you owe him, it's not worth it." The younger biker swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He started, but the leader cut him off. "That's enough," the leader shouted, his voice echoing in the still night. He turned back to Sarah, his eyes blazing. "You don't get to talk to my crew. You don't get to tell us what to do. And you sure as hell don't get to walk away from this." Sarah sighed, the sound barely audible. "I was hoping we could avoid this," she said quietly. The leader lunged, his frustration boiling over. But Sarah was ready. She stepped aside, her movements fluid and controlled, and his swing missed her by inches. Before he could recover, she pivoted, her elbow striking his rib cage with precision. He stumbled back, clutching his side, his expression a mix of shock and pain. The others hesitated, their confidence wavering as they watched their leader falter. Sarah's stance didn't change. She didn't press the advantage, didn't move to attack. She just stood there, waiting, her posture steady and unyielding. "Anyone else?" she asked, her voice calm. The wiry biker with the pipe stepped forward, his grip tightening on the metal. "You're gonna pay for that," he growled, raising the pipe. Sarah moved before he could strike. She closed the distance between them in an instant, her hand catching his wrist as the pipe came down. With a sharp twist, she disarmed him, the pipe clattering to the ground. He swung his other fist, but she ducked, her shoulder driving into his chest and sending him stumbling back. He tripped over his own feet, landing hard on the asphalt. The others froze, their bravado draining as they watched two of their own taken down with such ease. "I don't want to hurt you," Sarah said, her voice steady but firm. "But if you don't leave now, I won't have a choice." The leader struggled to his feet, his breathing labored. "What are you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "Someone who knows how to end this before anyone else gets hurt." The pack shifted uneasily, their confidence shattered. Even the leader seemed to hesitate, his pride warring with the fear he couldn't quite hide. The younger biker took a step forward, his voice trembling but resolute. "Boss, she's right. Let's go." The leader rounded on him, his face contorted with rage. "You don't get to tell me what to do." But the younger biker stood his ground, his hands trembling but clenched. "I'm done," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not doing this anymore." The leader's face twisted in fury, but he didn't have a chance to respond. Sarah stepped forward, her gaze locking onto his. "This is over," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. For a moment, it seemed like he might fight her again. But then he looked at his crew, at the fear in their eyes, the hesitation in their movements, and he knew he'd lost. "Fine," he spat, his voice bitter. "We're leaving." He turned on his heel, mounting his bike with a wince. The others followed, their movements subdued, their confidence shattered. The younger biker hesitated, glancing at Sarah one last time. "Thank you," he said softly before climbing onto his bike and riding away. As the roar of engines faded into the distance, Sarah exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. She glanced at the empty lot, then at her truck. The night was quiet again, but something had shifted. The leader's hand shot out toward Sarah's arm, but he never stood a chance. Before he could make contact, Sarah moved with a speed and precision that caught everyone off guard. She twisted his wrist, forcing him to drop the blade he'd been clutching. A sharp cry of pain escaped his lips as she leveraged his arm, guiding him down to his knees in one fluid motion. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. The bikers froze, their bravado replaced with confusion and fear. The leader knelt on the asphalt, gasping for breath as Sarah stood over him, her calm, unyielding gaze fixed on the group. "Stay down," she said, her tone low and commanding. One of the other bikers, a tall man with a heavy chain wrapped around his fist, stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he growled, raising the chain as if to strike. Sarah didn't hesitate. As he swung, she sidestepped effortlessly, her movements controlled and deliberate. Grabbing his arm mid-swing, she yanked him off balance, sending him stumbling into one of his friends. The chain clattered to the ground, useless. What the another biker sputtered, reaching into his jacket for a knife. But Sarah had already anticipated the move. She closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, her hand locking onto his wrist before the blade could clear its sheath. With a calculated twist, she disarmed him and shoved him backward, his feet skidding on the gravel. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't exaggerated. Every motion was efficient, precise, and deliberate, like she'd done this 1,000 times before. The leader, still on his knees, stared up at her in shock, cradling his injured arm. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by disbelief and a flicker of fear. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice shaking. Sarah stepped back, her stance steady and composed. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. Flipping it open, she held it up for them to see. The military ID inside was unmistakable. "Sergeant Sarah Mitchell," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Combat nurse. Afghanistan. And I've seen worse than you." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the group. The younger biker, the one who had hesitated earlier, took a step back, his face pale. "Combat nurse," he whispered, almost to himself. Sarah's gaze swept over the group, her calm demeanor underpinned by an unshakable authority. "I've patched up men under fire. I've carried the wounded out of ambushes. And I've fought off people who thought they could take advantage of chaos. Trust me," she said, her tone hardening, "you don't want to find out what else I learned over there." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Their confidence, which had seemed so unshakable earlier, was crumbling before their eyes. The wiry biker with the pipe took a step forward, his voice shaking as he tried to salvage the situation. "You're just bluffing. You can't take all of us." Sarah didn't flinch. She reached down and picked up the chain one of them had dropped earlier. The metal links clinked softly as she tested its weight in her hands, her movements deliberate and calm. "I don't need to take all of you," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I just need to take the first one who tries." The chain dangled loosely from her hand, but the tension in the air was suffocating. No one moved. The leader finally broke the silence, his voice cracking as he barked, "Enough. Back off." The others hesitated, glancing between him and Sarah. His tone had lost its usual edge, replaced with a mix of frustration and fear. "Boss," one of them started, but the leader cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I said back off," he snapped, staggering to his feet. He clutched his injured arm, glaring at Sarah with a mixture of hatred and humiliation. "We're leaving." Sarah didn't lower her guard, her gaze following their every movement as they reluctantly began to retreat. The younger biker lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. There was something in his expression, gratitude, perhaps, or maybe just relief. "You don't have to stay with them," Sarah said quietly, her tone softening. He hesitated, glancing back at the others, but ultimately he turned and followed them to their bikes. The rumble of engines filled the air as the group rode off into the night, their bravado shattered. When the last headlight disappeared into the darkness, Sarah let out a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders easing. She glanced around the empty lot, her eyes scanning for any signs of lingering danger. Satisfied that the threat was gone, she walked back to her truck. As she reached for the door handle, the faint sound of clapping broke the silence. Sarah turned, her eyes narrowing, to see the gas station attendant standing in the doorway. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tinged with awe, "I don't know who you are, but I'm glad you were here tonight." Sarah offered a faint smile, her composure returning. "Just passing through," she said simply. The attendant shook his head, stepping closer. "They've been terrorizing this place for months. Nobody's ever stood up to them like that." Sarah's smile faded slightly, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "Sometimes, standing up is the only choice you have," she said quietly. The attendant nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, I'd say you gave them something to think about." Sarah didn't respond. She climbed into her truck, the familiar hum of the engine breaking the stillness. As she pulled out onto the dark highway, the attendant watched her go, shaking his head in disbelief. For Sarah, the road ahead was long, and the weight of her past was heavy. But tonight, at least, she had made a difference. And somewhere out there, on a lonely stretch of asphalt, a group of bikers was rethinking the choices that had brought them to that gas station. As Sarah drove off into the night, the leader of the bikers, Jake, slowed his motorcycle to a stop a few miles down the road. The rest of the group pulled up behind him, the rumble of engines quieting as confusion and frustration brewed among them. "What was that back there?" one of the bikers, a wiry man named Rick, demanded, pulling off his helmet. His face was flushed with anger and disbelief. "We just got our butts handed to us by one woman." Jake turned slowly, still cradling his arm where Sarah had twisted it. The pain was sharp, but it was the humiliation that cut deeper. He glared at Rick, his jaw tightening. "Shut it. We underestimated her." "Underestimated?" Rick scoffed. "She's not even armed. We had the numbers." "How does that happen?" "She's trained," muttered the younger biker, Kyle, who had been hesitant from the start. His voice was quieter, but there was a note of respect in it that the others didn't miss. "You saw her. She didn't just fight us off, she studied us. She knew exactly what to do." Jake's face darkened, his pride wounded further by Kyle's words. "What are you? A fan now?" he growled. "No," Kyle said firmly, his gaze steady. "But maybe we should think about what we're doing. That woman isn't someone we should have messed with. She's seen more than any of us. You heard her combat nurse. She's been through war. We're not even close to her level." Jake sneered but didn't argue. He hated to admit it, but Kyle was right. There had been something different about Sarah, something that set her apart from anyone they'd encountered before. She wasn't just brave, she was skilled. Rick crossed his arms, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So what now? We just let her embarrass us like that? Walk away with our tails between our legs?" Kyle hesitated, his conscience battling with his loyalty to the group. He remembered the way Sarah had looked at him back at the gas station, her words still echoing in his mind, "You don't have to stay with them." "She wasn't trying to humiliate us," Kyle said finally. "She was defending herself. And honestly, we had it coming." The group fell silent, the weight of Kyle's words settling over them. For the first time, even Rick seemed at a loss for a retort. Jake's fists clenched, his pride still roaring louder than his reason. "I don't care what she's been through," he snarled. "Nobody makes me look like a fool and gets away with it." Kyle shook his head, exhaling slowly. "Maybe it's not about getting even," he said quietly. "Maybe it's about realizing we're not as tough as we think we are. She could have hurt us a lot worse, Jake. She chose not to." Jake glared at him but didn't respond. The truth was hard to ignore. Meanwhile, Sarah continued down the highway, her mind replaying the events of the night. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white against the leather. Adrenaline still coursed through her veins, but it was the memories that lingered, the echoes of a life she had tried to leave behind. She had spent years in war zones, patching up soldiers under fire, pulling people out of impossible situations. Her hands had saved countless lives, but they had also learned to fight when there was no other option. It was a skill she had hoped never to use again, but tonight, it had been necessary. Her phone buzzed on the dashboard, pulling her out of her thoughts? She glanced at the screen. It was an old friend from her unit, someone who had been with her through the worst of it. "Hey, Sarah," the familiar voice greeted her when she answered. "I was just thinking about you. Everything okay?" Sarah hesitated, her gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. "Yeah," she said finally, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "Just had a run-in with some troublemakers. Nothing I couldn't handle." The friend chuckled softly. "That's you all right. Always handling things. You ever think about taking a break from being the world's problem solver?" Sarah smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "You know me. Trouble seems to find me no matter where I go." "True enough," the friend agreed. There was a pause before they added, "You ever need to talk, you know where to find me." "Thanks," Sarah said quietly, ending the call. She pulled off at the next exit, finding a small diner bathed in neon light. The sign flickered, half the letters burned out, but it was open. She parked her truck and stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The waitress behind the counter greeted her with a tired smile. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee," Sarah replied, taking a seat by the window. As she sipped the steaming cup, her mind wandered back to the bikers. She didn't regret standing her ground, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had been a wake-up call not just for them, but for her, too. The waitress returned with a refill, pausing to study Sarah's face. "Rough night?" Sarah glanced up, offering a small smile. "You could say that." The waitress nodded knowingly. "Well, whatever it is, you look like someone who can handle themselves." "Thanks," Sarah said, her smile fading slightly. She looked out the window, the reflection of the neon sign casting faint colors across the glass. In the distance, the hum of motorcycles faded into the night. Back on the road, the bikers rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Jake, the sting of defeat was unbearable, but even he couldn't deny the truth: Sarah had been a force they hadn't expected. Kyle, riding near the back of the group, made a silent decision. The next chance he got, he was walking away from the gang. Sarah's words had stuck with him, planting a seed of doubt that he couldn't ignore. As they disappeared into the darkness, Sarah sat in the quiet diner, her thoughts heavy but resolute. The scars on her hands told a story of battles fought and lessons learned. Tonight, she had added another chapter, a reminder that strength wasn't about looking for a fight but knowing when to stand your ground. And somewhere out there, a group of bikers was learning that very same lesson. The roar of the bikers' engines faded into the night, leaving the gas station eerily quiet. Sarah stood still for a moment, letting the adrenaline drain from her system. Her chest rose and fell in steady breaths, but her mind was still sharp, processing every detail of what had just happened. From behind the counter, the gas station attendant, a young man barely in his 20s, cautiously stepped out. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his cap. Ma'am. Are you okay?" Sarah turned to him, her expression softening. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "Are you okay?" The young man blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "Me? Yeah, I mean, they didn't bother me, but I thought they were going to trash the place or something." "Then you..." He paused, shaking his head in disbelief. "That was unreal. Who are you?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the horizon where the bikers had disappeared, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Just someone who doesn't like bullies," she said simply. The attendant nodded slowly, his admiration evident. "Well, you sure showed them. I've never seen anything like it." He hesitated, then added, "Do you think they'll come back?" Sarah considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "No. They know better now." The attendant exhaled in relief, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since the confrontation. Thank you. Really? That could have gone a lot worse. Sarah gave him a small nod, then walked to her truck. She opened the door but paused before climbing in, her gaze shifting back to the young man. Next time someone like that shows up, don't try to handle it yourself, she said, her tone gentle but firm. Call for help. And if you can, stay out of sight. You don't want to be in their way. He nodded quickly, taking her advice to heart. I will. Thanks again, ma'am. Sarah smiled faintly, then climbed into her truck and started the engine. The rumble of the old vehicle was steady, grounding. As she pulled out of the gas station and onto the highway, the events of the evening played back in her mind. The biker gang had pulled over at a rest stop, the air between them thick with tension. Jake, the leader, paced back and forth, his injured arm cradled against his chest. His face was twisted in a mix of anger and humiliation. Rick leaned against his bike, glaring at Jake. Well, that was a disaster, he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Great leadership, boss. Jake whirled on him, his good hand curling into a fist. You think this is funny, he growled. We got blindsided by a woman who he stopped himself, the words catching in his throat. A woman who's tougher than all of us put together, Kyle interjected quietly. His voice wasn't mocking, but it carried a weight that silenced the group. Rick sneered. Oh, here we go. The kid's got a crush on her now, huh? Kyle didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he looked Jake in the eye. You saw what she could do. She didn't just beat us, she held back. She could have done a lot worse, but she didn't. Why do you think that is? Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Kyle pressed on. Because she didn't see us as a real threat. And let's be honest, we weren't. We thought we were tough, but we're just a bunch of guys riding around looking for trouble. She's been through real fights, real danger. We don't even come close. The group fell silent, the weight of Kyle's words settling over them. Even Rick, who usually had a snide remark for everything, seemed to deflate. Jake finally stopped pacing and sank onto the curb, his injured arm resting on his knee. What are you saying, kid? That we should just pack it in? Quit the gang? Kyle hesitated, then nodded. Maybe. Or maybe we need to think about what we're doing with our lives. Is this it? Picking on people who didn't do anything to us, trying to prove we're tough? Because tonight, we got shown what real strength looks like. And it's not us. Jake let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You think it's that easy to walk away? This is who we are. Kyle stepped forward, his gaze steady. It doesn't have to be. He glanced around at the others. We can do better than this. We don't have to keep doing the same stupid stuff, hurting people for no reason. We have a choice. The group exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, doubt crept into their hardened expressions. Sarah drove through the quiet night, the hum of her truck's engine a soothing contrast to the earlier chaos. She didn't regret what she'd done, but the encounter had stirred something in her, a reminder of the life she'd left behind. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. She glanced at it briefly before answering. Hey, Sarah, the familiar voice of her old commander greeted her. Heard you had some excitement tonight. Sarah chuckled softly. Word travels fast. You know how it is, the commander replied. You okay? I'm fine, Sarah said. She hesitated, then added, it's just, sometimes I wonder if I'll ever stop running into trouble. The commander laughed. Trouble has a way of finding people like you. But you've got the skills to handle it. And from what I hear, you handled tonight pretty well. Sarah's smile faded slightly. Yeah, but it's not just about handling it. It's about what comes after. You think people like that can change? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Maybe. If they're smart enough to learn from their mistakes. And if they're not, well, that's on them, isn't it? Sarah nodded to herself, the words resonating. Yeah. I guess it is. As she hung up, the faint glow of a diner sign appeared in the distance. She decided to stop for a coffee, needing a moment to reflect. The waitress set a steaming cup of coffee in front of Sarah, offering a kind smile. Rough night. Sarah met her gaze, her own smile faint but genuine. You could say that. The waitress nodded knowingly. Well, whatever it was, you look like someone who can handle themselves. Sarah's eyes flickered with a mix of gratitude and something deeper resolve. Thanks, she said softly. As she sipped her coffee, the events of the night began to settle in her mind. She couldn't control the world around her, but she could control how she responded to it. And tonight, she had stood her ground, not just for herself but for anyone who had ever been underestimated or pushed around. Somewhere out there, she hoped the bikers were reflecting on their choices. Whether they changed or not wasn't up to her. But she had given them a reason to think twice before picking on someone else. And that, she decided, was enough. As Sarah drove away from the diner, the world outside her truck's windows was quiet. The road stretched on endlessly, like an uncharted path. The night was cool, and the headlights of her truck cast long, sharp shadows across the asphalt. It had been a strange night full of tension, surprise, and a sudden release of the kind of energy that only came from standing up for herself when she needed to. But as the road ahead of her unfolded, Sarah's thoughts drifted to something deeper than the confrontation at the gas station. Something more than the bikers who had tried, and failed, to intimidate her. Strength isn't always obvious. Most people would look at Sarah and see a woman who didn't stand out in any way. She didn't walk with the confidence that screamed, "I'm the strongest person in the room." Her appearance wasn't designed to strike fear or demand attention. She wore no flashy armor, no signs of her past battles. She was just, her. A quiet figure, blending in with the world around her, much like the ordinary highway she drove down. But that night, she had shown exactly what true strength was. Her mind wandered back to the moment when the bikers had tried to corner her. They thought they knew everything about power. To them, power was about the loud rumble of motorcycle engines, the muscle that came with big bodies and leather jackets. They thought they could intimidate her, control her. But Sarah knew better. Real strength comes from within. She had learned that lesson long ago. Back in the war zones, amidst the chaos and bloodshed, she had discovered something crucial: strength wasn't about how big or tough you looked. It wasn't about the size of your fists or how much noise you could make. Real strength was about resolve, skill, and perhaps most importantly knowing when to act and when to remain calm. It was about understanding the situation, keeping control over your emotions, and making the right moves at the right time. That was what made Sarah dangerous in a way the bikers could never understand. They relied on their size, their intimidation tactics, but she relied on the one thing they didn't expect: control. Control over herself, control over the moment, control over her choices. The bikers had underestimated her, not realizing that the woman standing in front of them had faced far worse challenges, had survived in far tougher situations. They thought they were the toughest ones in the room, but Sarah knew something they didn't. It's not the loudest who are the strongest. It's the quiet ones, the ones who wait until the right moment. Her mind returned to her last words to the gang before they left. Unless you want to find out just how much I learned over there, I suggest you leave. For Sarah, those words weren't just about the physical fight that had just occurred. They were about what she had been through, what she had learned from being a combat nurse in some of the world's most dangerous places. In those war zones, every decision could be life or death. She wasn't just learning how to fight. She was learning how to save lives, how to handle pressure, and how to take control of situations that were out of her hands. The scars on her hands weren't just reminders of the trauma, they were marks of wisdom, of the hard-earned knowledge that no biker, no matter how tough, could intimidate her. And when you have that kind of strength, the kind that comes from experience, it's easy to see through the bluster of someone who hasn't been through the same. Don't judge by appearances. It's a lesson people often forget. We all have a tendency to judge others by their outward appearances, to make snap decisions based on what we see on the surface. But the truth is, you can never know the whole story from a glance. The world is full of quiet strength, of people who carry untold stories of survival and resilience, people who've been through things most could never imagine. The bikers learned that lesson the hard way. They thought Sarah was just some woman standing by a truck. She wasn't. She was a force to be reckoned with. They underestimated her, assuming she would be easy to push around. But the moment they tried, she showed them exactly why they shouldn't have. And what's the lesson here? Never underestimate someone just because they don't fit your idea of tough. You might think they're an easy target, that they're harmless. You might think you can push them around, make them back down. But the truth is, you never know what someone's capable of until they show you. Strength is in the heart, not the size. Think about it. How many times have we judged someone based on their appearance? How many times have we thought, oh, they're not tough enough, or they don't look like they could handle this? We all do it, whether consciously or not. We look at the loud, brash, confident people, and we assume they are the strongest. But often, they're the ones who crumble when things get tough. The quiet ones, the ones who carry themselves with a calm sense of self, are the ones who often have the most to offer. They're the ones who wait for the right moment, who don't waste energy on proving themselves to anyone. They've learned that actions speak louder than words, and when the moment comes, they act decisively, without hesitation. Sarah wasn't loud or brash. She didn't try to stand out. She just was. And that was enough. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand your ground. As Sarah continued down the road, the landscape outside her truck window seemed to shift. It wasn't just about the bikers or the gas station anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or judged. It was about the countless people who walked through life quietly, not drawing attention to themselves, but who had strength inside them, strength that was waiting for the right moment to be released. And maybe, just maybe, the world needed more of those quiet types. The ones who didn't seek power but had it when it was necessary. The ones who stood firm when everyone else folded. Sarah wasn't just tough. She was wise. And that's the kind of strength that lasts. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. A message from her old commander. It was short, but it made her smile. Don't let them get to you. You've got this. She didn't need a reminder. She knew it already. Sometimes, strength isn't about the battles we fight or the enemies we face. Sometimes, it's about knowing who we are, standing firm in our own truth, and showing the world what we're capable of, even if they don't expect it. And as Sarah continued her journey down the highway, she felt a quiet pride inside. She had faced the chaos. She had stood her ground. And she had come out stronger because of it. The world may underestimate you, but that's their mistake. And in the end, it's always those who underestimate you that learn the hardest lessons. So never doubt your own strength. Never let anyone make you feel small. And never forget, your silence may be the most powerful weapon you have. The road ahead was long, but Sarah knew she was ready for whatever it held. Because, like the quietest people in the room, she had already won the battle.